It's Ludden. Today I'm going to be discussing Chapter 10 from the Skinner book, The Inner World of Motivation and Emotion. Um, Basically, in this chapter, Skinner looks at what occurs inside the mind um, and how we as people commonly talk about and describe situations in a mentalistic or emotional manner. He talks about a lot of Freud's ideas and how some of them can be problematic. He looks at this way of mentalistic thinking and the behaviors that occur under the skin and gives an alternate way of thinking and obviously a more behavioral explanation. The first section is about personalities. So here he kind of is breaking down personalities and talks about the thinking mind. A self or personality is just a repertoire of behavior constructed from a set of organized contingencies. And he talks about how one person can have different personalities. An example here is what young people say and do when they're with their parents. It's not the same way that they behave when they're around their peers. They say and do different things when they're with their peers. Another example is the behavior repertoire of a person um, that a person acquires growing up with his family, kind of sets his foundation, makes up his or her core values. And then the behavior repertoire that that same person acquires while in the armed services is another set of core values. And he goes on to say that the two selves or the two personalities may exist in the same skin without conflict until the contingencies conflict. So in this case, um, this person uh, coming home and his friends from the armed services visiting him. So now he has these two these two conflicting contingencies. How is he going to act? The way he was brought up in his home, or the way that he behaves with his buddies in the armed services. Conflicting contingencies create conflicting repertoires of behavior, but the point is that it's still the same one person that is engaging in these set of behaviors, depending on what environment he or she is in. So there's an example in this section that somebody that normally behaves in a considerate or kind manner will also behave in a cruel or mean way at times. And the point I think to take away here is that behavior is subject to the environment. He then talks about Freud and the model of the psyche. So the ID, the superego, and the ego. So the ID is the primitive and instinctual part of the mind that makes decisions and responds to reinforcement. The superego operates as a moral conscience, and the ego is the realistic part that mediates between the desires of the ID and the superego. The ego is the product of practical contingencies in daily life, susceptible to reinforcement and contingencies. Skinner says that most people refer to the psyche for why people behave in certain ways, but that it's actually the environmental contingencies that are responsible for how we behave, as these environmental contingencies don't change and they're more reliable. So we can observe that, we can measure that, as opposed to what's going on inside the mind. The life in the psyche. This is the next section. So the life of the mind is said to require and consume psychic energy. Um, so the probability of behavior occurs due to contingencies of survival or reinforcement. Then goes into instincts and what instincts are. They're the innate susceptibilities to reinforcement that shape behavior and give behavior purpose. These susceptibilities depend on the survival value in the evolution of the species. He then goes on to talk about having differences in mind and that the mind has different parts for different behaviors. And he makes a few examples here. He makes an example of us all having the capability of being violent, but that there's a part of the brain that throws up a barrier to keep this in check. He also talks about music, and I'm paraphrasing here, but being an outlet for emotion, and when listening to music or playing an instrument or singing, you're not necessarily thinking about politics. So there's different parts of the mind for different behaviors. The best known division of mind, he says, is between conscious and unconscious. Unconscious is the repressed wishes and fears. Conscious is being aware of and responding to one's surroundings. Uh, he goes on to say that behaviorism rejects the unconscious mind as a factor or a motive for one's behavior because it's not observed. And we've learned so far that if it's not observed, it's not a behavior. And if I read into this correctly, Skinner kind of makes sure to take a shot at Freud by saying, Freud stated that it doesn't need to be observed in order to be effective. He then talks about the intrapsychic life of the mind, and that people often speak of this intrapsychic life, that it's totally independent of the physical world. And in this world, feelings, memories, or emotions evoke feelings, memories, or emotions. So, which then results in a behavior occurring. So some examples here are feelings of frustration, which then lead to feelings of powerlessness, which then lead to apathy, which then lead to aggression. Another example is weakened faith then leads to anxiety or depression, which then disrupts thoughts or disrupts your thought process. So Skinner turns to the facts that these mentalistic expressions are based on. He says that you can identify the contingencies of reinforcement which account for the intrapsychic activity. So that example of frustration is generated by extinction, and extinction is also responsible for aggression. The next part of the chapter is Freud's defense mechanisms. So he talks about these three factors: repression, conversion, and sublimation. Basically, this is the idea that personality reactions are an individual's reactions in an attempt to satisfy his or her emotional needs. So, like a person engaging in a behavior to reduce anxiety or guilt. So, with repression, this is where wishes or impulses are incapable of fulfillment, are kept from, or made inaccessible to consciousness. So Skinner basically says that this word repression is just an elaborate metaphor and basically a dramatic way to refer to the effect of punishment. So the whole repression narrative is that when feelings can't be expressed, pressure builds up until an individual explodes or has an aggressive outburst. And Skinner says that if one of these explosions happens, it's because something in the environment changed. The quote-unquote pressure is a result of the desired behavior being previously punished or not reinforced. And that this pressure could be reduced by just providing an environment where the desired behavior can be emitted. An example here, he talks about a psychiatrist saying that allowing kids to play with toy guns gives them some sort of an outlet for their aggressive urges. But Skinner says that we should really just say that this is just an example of allowing kids to behave aggressively in unpunished ways. Conversion is the transformation of an unconscious conflict to a physical symptom. So examples here are, the thoughts of rage produce a physical ulcer, or a pregnant woman's hatred of her own baby or of the father causes her to have a miscarriage. And Skinner goes on to say that although these things may be medically related, the mind or psychic doesn't control or create these outcomes. And then the last one, sublimation, I didn't really understand this part. If somebody wants to discuss that further, that would be helpful. But it said that it was the discharge of instinctual energy through socially approved activities, but he didn't really give any examples or expand on that. But in summary, these defense mechanisms aren't psychic processes taking place in the depths of the mind, but just behaviors occurring in response to reinforcement and punishment. The next section is inner causes. So this section talks about the idea of engaging in a behavior because of a certain feeling an individual has. So an example here is a person feels angry, and he or she is so focused on the way that they're feeling, or this feeling of anger, it's taken over their body, and it's the reason for engaging in aggressive behavior. And Skinner says that both the feeling and the action taken can be explained. And when an antecedent is not easily identified, it's common for a person to attribute their behavior to a feeling. Like somebody who says that they're angry, but they don't know why. Another example here is a musician who comes home and he's feeling sad, and in that moment, a specific note just came to him, and then this sad song was created. And Skinner clarifies that it didn't just come to him, but something happened in his environment, which then created a feeling of sadness, which then resulted in him creating music. The last section of the chapter, uselessness of inner causes, where he kind of sums it all up here. He says that the exploration of the mind and emotions has been described as one of the great achievements in the history of human thought, but it's possible it's one of the great disasters. He goes on to say that this train of thought has given people an idea that things are caused by feelings, and when really we should be looking at antecedents within the environment for why things occur or why certain behaviors are happening. Skinner makes his point by bringing up a quote, "Minds kill, not guns," and kind of mockingly says, if that's the case, then we shouldn't try to keep guns from assassins. We should try to do something else since it's their mind. He goes on to say that by looking at the psyche and the inner mind as causes for actions or behavior, gets in the way of really looking at the environment and what is really happening. And although a person's feelings or emotions may be real, you can't see them or observe them. They're under the skin and will be forever. We should instead look at the environment, which is always accessible and observable, and we can learn much more by studying the contingencies of reinforcement and punishment within the environment. So that's pretty much it for the chapter. My question to you relates to this section in the chapter where Skinner talks about personalities, because I thought that was pretty interesting, and how personalities are a repertoire of behavior constructed from a set of organized contingencies. So with that said, where does your personality come from? Think about your personal set of contingencies or experiences in the past. If that's too personal, you don't want to talk about that, you can talk about somebody else's personality. That is all I have. Thank you for your time.